The screams were swallowed by the roar of the engines as the Boeing 707 banked sharply, a sudden, violent maneuver that threw passengers against their seatbelts, their lives hanging in the balance, utterly dependent on a single, silent act. Now, years later, the truth remains locked away, classified deeper than the ocean's floor. A secret whispered only in the hushed halls of intelligence agencies. This is the story of Silent Flight, a mission so covert, so surgically precise, that its success meant anonymity for those who made it happen. It was a story of lives saved, threats neutralized, and the unbearable burden carried by those who acted in the shadows, their deeds unsung, their sacrifices unacknowledged. The hum of the cabin, a low thrum of anticipation, and the gentle creaks of the aircraft filled the pre-dawn darkness of a nondescript office in Tel Aviv. The scent of stale coffee and cold steel hung heavy in the air, a familiar aroma to Daniel Koren, a man whose life was measured in shades of gray. He was a man of the mind, a data analyst with a particular talent for seeing the patterns within chaos, for interpreting the whispers of threat hidden within intercepted communications. His office, a sterile box of screens and secure lines, was his world, and today, that world felt impossibly small, claustrophobic. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him, a physical ache that settled in his chest. He had spent weeks poring over intelligence, piecing together fragments of information like a master jigsaw puzzle. Whispers of a planned attack, a potential hijacking of an El Al flight, targeting the lifeblood of Israel's connection to the world. The specifics were murky, the details elusive, but the threat was undeniably real. The implications were catastrophic, hundreds of lives hanging in the balance, a tragedy that could ignite the region. Daniel rubbed a hand over his face, the stubble of his beard scratching against his skin. The air in the office was thick with the silent tension of impending action. He had been present for a great many tense situations, but this was different. This was not a military operation, a surgical strike. This was a war fought on the unsuspecting battlefield of civilian life. He looked at the faces staring back at him from the various monitors. The aircrew, the passengers, a selection of satellite images and intelligence reports. He felt a pang of guilt, a familiar ache, knowing that in a matter of hours, decisions he made would decide their fate. He leaned forward, adjusting the volume on the secure line. The voice on the other end, terse and urgent, relayed the final briefing. The operation was a go. His mind raced, calculating the odds, reviewing the profiles, assessing the risks. The decision had been made, the plan was in motion, a complex dance of preparation and anticipation. He looked at the photograph of Rachel Stein, the agent who would be the key in this operation. A flash of admiration and concern crossed his face. The weight of her responsibility, her bravery, was a constant, almost palpable presence. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, picturing the scenario unfolding. A horrifying ballet of violence played out amidst the normalcy of a commercial flight. He knew the cost of failure. He also knew the cost of success, a price that would haunt him long after the echoes of this flight faded into silence. The blood-soaked cabin, a scene of impossible calm masking a brutal ballet of lethal precision, would forever be etched in Daniel Koren's memory, a phantom limb that throbbed with the ghost of a decision he had made with chilling clarity. He hadn't pulled the trigger, hadn't wielded the blade, but the weight of those two silent deaths rested squarely on his shoulders. He was the architect, the strategist, the one who had signed off on the execution. Daniel Koren was not a field operative, nor did he possess the steely nerves of a combat soldier. He was an analyst, a man of numbers and probabilities, a master of the unseen. His office, tucked away in a sterile, windowless room within the Mossad headquarters, hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Monitors glowed with encrypted data streams, overflowing in their coded language. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the quiet rustle of paper, the symphony of 1,000 silent calculations. His background was unremarkable. Born to a family of academics, he had a natural aptitude for languages and a sharp, analytical mind. He drifted into intelligence work almost by accident, seduced by the intellectual challenge and the allure of secrets. He found satisfaction in the meticulous dissection of complex problems, in the crafting of narratives from fragmented information. It was a world of whispers and shadows, where the stakes were always life and death. The silent flight case, as it came to be known within the classified circles, had landed on his desk like a particularly unpleasant puzzle. Intercepted communications, chatter from informants, pieces of a terrifying mosaic that threatened to coalesce into a single, devastating image. A terrorist plot to hijack an El Al flight and use it as a weapon. The details were murky, the certainty elusive. But the potential consequences were clear. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of innocent lives hanging in the balance. He remembered the pressure, a vice tightening around his chest. The clock was ticking, each second a gamble. The weight of responsibility pressed down, making him question every decision, every deduction. His superiors, their faces grim, pressed for a definitive answer, demanding a recommendation. He had to decide, to filter the noise, the possibilities, and find the singular truth. The room seemed to shrink, the silence amplifying the thrumming of his own heartbeat. He visualized the plane, its metal shell holding within it, unknowingly, its imminent destruction. He pictured the passengers, unaware of the lethal dance being planned in the shadows. He could feel the urgency, the desperation. He could only see the possible outcomes, the cascading losses. Daniel had pored over every detail, every intercepted communication, every scrap of intel. He'd cross-referenced names, analyzed patterns, and evaluated risks. The threat was credible, but the information was incomplete, frustrating. He questioned his assessment, doubted his judgment. He wrestled with his doubts. Could he, in good conscience, unleash a plan that risked so many lives? Could he live with the guilt if he was wrong? The absence of the third target. The missing piece of the puzzle. Now, the risks were multiplied. But how many potential lives could he save? It all rested on the tip of the balance, the scales tipped by a decision that had to be made, a decision he'd live with for the rest of his life. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and made his recommendation. The answer, when it came, felt less like a triumph of intellect and more like a surrender to fate. The sterile air of the command center hung heavy, thick with the scent of stale coffee and the low hum of surveillance equipment. A stark contrast to the impending terror that was about to unfold at 30,000 feet. Daniel Corrin's gut clenched, knowing that 2 lives, possibly more, hung precariously in the balance, resting solely on the shaky foundation of intercepted whispers and educated guesses, as he prepared himself to make the biggest call of his career. The room was a symphony of flickering screens, each a window into a different facet of the unfolding drama. Maps traced the flight path of El Al Flight 426, blinking indicators representing radar blips and communication streams. Analysts hunched over desks, their faces illuminated by the ghostly glow of computer monitors, deciphering encrypted messages and sifting through mountains of data. The air crackled with tension, a tangible weight that pressed down on Daniel's shoulders. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the physical manifestation of the mental knots tightening in his stomach. The absence of the third target, the knowledge that the planned attack hinged on incomplete information, gnawed at him. He replayed the intelligence, the fragmented pieces of the puzzle that formed the basis for this entire operation. The intercepted communications, hinting at a meticulously planned hijacking, the surveillance photos, capturing the faces of the suspected perpetrators, the eyewitness reports, all woven together, created a compelling, but ultimately incomplete narrative. He felt the weight of every life on that flight, each passenger a precious, vulnerable being, trusting in the safety of the metal bird hurtling through the sky, and also the weight of the unknown, the fear of the devastating chaos to come if his judgment failed. Daniel stared at the profile photos, the cold, clinical assessment of faces that held the potential for so much death. The decision to proceed, to unleash the silent predator, was a gamble. There were no guarantees, no definitive proof, only educated assessments and intuition honed by years of analyzing threats. He knew the potential consequences. The ripple effects of failure were almost too terrible to consider. The public outcry, the diplomatic fallout, the inevitable scrutiny of the Mossad's methods, the lives of innocent people, sacrificed on the altar of a well-intentioned but ultimately flawed piece of intelligence. He could almost feel the vibration of the plane, the faint roar of the engines, the subtle shift in pressure as it ascended. As he looked at the clock, Time became a relentless predator. Each passing minute increased the danger, inching them closer to the moment of decision. He tasted ash and despair, aware of the agonizing choices that needed to be made. He felt the sting of doubt, that insidious enemy that plagued every intelligence operative. Was he making the right call? Could he live with the consequences, regardless of the outcome? The weight of his decision was crushing. But Daniel knew, with the cold certainty of the soldier, that he must choose, and then he must live with the consequences. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs, and prepared for the inevitable. The time for deliberation was over. The time for action was upon them. The sterile air of the control room felt thick with a tension he could taste, a metallic tang that clung to the back of Daniel Corrin's throat as the radio crackled. He knew, with a certainty that clawed at his gut, that if things went wrong, they would be written off as collateral damage. The weight of those potential lives, the hundreds he was responsible for, settled on his shoulders, a crushing burden he hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. The Rome to Tel Aviv flight, LL 426, was wheels up, and for Daniel, the game had changed. The meticulously crafted operation, the hours of planning, the risk assessments, all of it hinged on the presence of 3 men, the Palestinian militants identified as the primary threat. But only 2 had boarded. The third, the one whose face stared back at him from the grainy photograph pinned to the board, was a ghost. Had he been intercepted? Had the operation been aborted? Or was he simply a decoy, a distraction designed to sow confusion and delay? The absence was a gaping hole in their certainty, a chasm of the unknown that threatened to swallow them whole. The small control room, usually humming with the low thrum of monitors and the quiet clatter of keyboards, now felt stiflingly silent. The air conditioning was failing, the heat from the equipment radiating outward, making the tension that much more palpable. Daniel found himself unconsciously wiping his palms on his trousers, the sweat clinging to the fabric. His gaze flicked between the screen displaying the flight path, a green line arcing across the Mediterranean, and the faces of his team, etched with a shared apprehension. Each of them knew the implications of their decision. Each of them knew that if Rachel, their operative on board, didn't have a full set, this would be catastrophic. The entire mission was built on the premise that 3 assassins would be on board. That Rachel would be able to handle 3 targets, not just 1, but now they didn't know if they had 2 or even 1 to worry about. He replayed the intelligence, the intercepts, the reports. They had built a solid case, a compelling narrative. The risk was undeniably high, but the potential devastation of a successful hijacking, an attack at the Tel Aviv airport, made the gamble necessary. Yet, uncertainty gnawed at him. Was it arrogance to proceed with the mission? Had they become so focused on preventing the worst that they had blinded themselves to the nuances of the situation? Daniel chewed on his lip, his eyes glued to the screen. He saw the flight climb, reaching cruising altitude. The minutes stretched into an eternity. He imagined the interior of the plane, the passengers settling in, the flight attendants beginning the service. Then, he imagined Rachel's face. Could he have told her that this was a probable, not a definite? Did she trust in her training? The thought of her executing their plan was like a knife in his gut. He wanted to reach out, to change things, but he was trapped, chained to the responsibility of his decisions. The responsibility of potentially sending this woman on a suicide mission. The phone on his desk rang, jolting him from his thoughts. It was the director. Daniel braced himself and answered the phone. The director's voice was low and devoid of emotion. "Anything, Daniel?" Daniel took a breath. "Nothing yet, sir." The director was silent. "They're at altitude." The news, when it came, felt like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole the air from his lungs. 2 down, 1 unaccounted for. Daniel Corrin gripped the edge of the worn mahogany desk, knuckles white, the sterile air of the secure briefing room suddenly too thin to breathe. He had authorized it. He had signed off on the intel. He had, in essence, sent Rachel Stein, the agent known only as Shira within the Mossad, into a steel coffin, trusting that her training, her instincts, her very life, would be enough. And now, the fate of hundreds hung on a single terrifying question mark. The seconds stretched, each one a relentless tick of the clock, a hammer blow against his composure. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions and the palpable weight of responsibility. The room itself, a study in drab functionality, offered no solace. The dull green walls, the flickering fluorescent lights, the bland, anonymous furniture, all seemed to press in on him, amplifying the feeling of isolation. He focused on the details to distract himself. The precise angle of the morning sun cutting through the barred window, the faint scent of stale coffee clinging to the air, the way the perspiration beaded on his forehead. He replayed the briefing in his mind, the meticulous analysis, the painstaking risk assessment, the agonizing decision to proceed. The absence of the third target. Had the operation been compromised? Had the terrorists changed their plans? Or were they simply waiting, biding their time, calculating their next move? The uncertainty gnawed at him, a relentless and unforgiving beast. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the next few hours, maybe even minutes, would define the rest of his life. His phone buzzed, a sharp, intrusive sound that ripped him from his thoughts. He hesitated, then reached for it. It was the comms officer. The man's voice clipped, controlled. "We have confirmation the aircraft is airborne. Estimated time to destination, approximately 6 hours. 6 hours. 6 hours to wait, to worry, to dissect every piece of the intelligence, every decision made, every potential outcome." He dismissed the comms officer. He rubbed a hand over his tired face, trying to erase the fatigue etched into his features. He couldn't afford to falter. He had to remain the calm, rational center, the one who could process the chaos, assess the risks, and make the impossible decisions. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, staring out at the hazy Tel Aviv skyline. The sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the city, yet the world outside seemed muted, devoid of color. It was as if the weight of his responsibility had cast a gray pall over everything. He thought of the passengers, oblivious to the danger, enjoying their in-flight meals, watching the onboard movie, completely unaware that a meticulously crafted plan was unfolding high above the Mediterranean. He thought of Shira, alone in the crowded cabin, her fate inextricably linked to those hundreds of strangers. He thought of the potential for failure, the catastrophic consequences, and he thought of the one thing he couldn't allow himself to think about: the possibility that he had made the wrong call. The cost of one wrong decision would be too heavy to bear. The wait began, and for Daniel Corrin, the silence was deafening, the burden unbearable. The world lurched into a silent crimson chaos as the first man crumpled, a geyser of blood blossoming on the pristine white linen of the tray table, the scent of stale coffee mixing sickeningly with the metallic tang of life's abrupt departure. Rachel, her breath a ragged rasp against the manufactured calm of the cabin, registered the shock in the man's eyes. A flash of recognition, then a horrifying blankness as he slumped forward, his face hitting the tray with a dull thud that was swallowed by the hum of the engines. The world narrowed to the feel of the ice pick's handle in her grip, the slick, oily sensation of the blade, and the desperate necessity to move, to act, before the inevitable panic broke. The antiseptic smell of the plane, usually a comfort, now felt suffocating, a prelude to the violence she was about to unleash. Each footstep on the plush carpet was a muffled drumbeat against the rising tide of adrenaline, the rhythmic pulse of her own blood echoing in her ears. She forced a smile, the practiced curve of her lips a grotesque mask against the terror threatening to consume her. The flight attendants, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding a few feet away, continued their routine. The casual chatter, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of the passengers, all became a distorted soundtrack to the macabre ballet she was about to perform. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a gilded cage. She moved towards the second target, her vision tunneling, focusing only on him, the way he held his newspaper, the slight furrow of his brow as he read. He looked up as she approached, the same dawning realization in his eyes as the first, a spark of pure, unadulterated fear. She saw the flash of movement towards his waistband, the instinctive grab for the concealed weapon, and she reacted. The ice pick, guided by years of training, found its mark, the impact a jarring jolt that traveled up her arm. There was a gasp, a choked sound lost in the pressurized cabin, and then silence. The second man sagged back into his seat, a scarlet stain blossoming across his crisp white shirt, the newspaper falling to the floor, displaying an image of serene landscapes now grotesquely juxtaposed with the reality of death. Her mind raced, a frantic calculation of time, threat, and the imperative to finish. She was a ghost in this metallic tomb, a shadow flitting through the aisles, unseen, unheard, a harbinger of sudden, silent death. Around her, life went on, unaware, unsuspecting, the fragile veneer of normalcy barely disturbed. She tasted the metallic tang of blood in the air, a phantom sensation, and fought the urge to retch. Her hands trembled as she wiped them, again and again, with a fresh service towel, the fabric absorbing the crimson stains. 2 down, 1 to go. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, a crushing burden she would have to carry. But there was no time to dwell, no time for regret. The mission demanded completion. The safety of the passengers depended on her. So she moved again, her face impassive, her smile fixed, a predator navigating a sea of unsuspecting prey, ready to execute her final, silent kill. The hum of the engines, once a comforting background, now seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of the altitude, the enclosed space, and the terrifying responsibility that rested on her shoulders. The stench of cordite, momentarily masked by the cloying scent of stale coffee, filled the confined space, a grim testament to the violence that had just unfolded. The bodies, slumped in their seats, presented a facade of sleep to the oblivious passengers. But a closer look revealed the truth. The crimson stains blossoming on their clothing, the unnatural angles of their necks. It was all a brutal testament to the accuracy of Rachel's training and the deadly efficiency of her mission. The initial investigation was swift and discreet, conducted under the cloak of official silence. As the medical team, feigning an interest in potential cardiac events, discreetly examined the deceased, the real work began behind closed doors. Men in anonymous suits, their faces etched with the grim resolve of seasoned investigators, meticulously collected evidence. The flight recorders, their data invaluable, were removed with practiced ease, their secrets destined for the secure vaults of intelligence agencies. Every aspect of the aircraft, every nook and cranny, was scoured for clues. The seemingly innocent cabin, once humming with the mundane activity of a routine flight, was now a crime scene, a canvas upon which a deadly ballet had played out. The weapons, cleverly concealed, were the first to be discovered. Dissected firearms, their individual components ingeniously hidden within the false bottoms of briefcases and travel bags, were revealed. These were not the tools of amateur terrorists. They were the meticulously crafted devices of seasoned operatives. Hidden within the linings of their coats were maps and photographs, meticulously drawn schematics of the El Al plane. Further analysis revealed the presence of forged passports, cleverly crafted with an attention to detail that only the most skilled forgers could achieve. These were not the documents of casual travelers. They were passports to death. But the most damning evidence lay within the belongings of the deceased, the notes scrawled in Arabic on a small, worn notepad. It was a step-by-step plan, a detailed blueprint of the intended attack. The weapons' locations, the targets, the planned trajectory. Every detail matched the intelligence Israel had received, the information that had led to the daring mission. The plan confirmed what Rachel already knew. She had averted a catastrophic event. She had saved lives. But the validation provided by the discovered evidence did little to dispel the lingering unease that gnawed at the edges of her mind. Further investigation into the hotel rooms of the deceased revealed details. Photos, clothing, and other personal items were collected, each piece providing a small, sometimes tragic window into the lives that had ended so abruptly. These men were not just faceless enemies. They had existed. They had planned. They had been prepared to sacrifice their lives and the lives of the innocents to realize their murderous intentions. All the evidence was meticulously documented, photographed, and catalogued. This information proved Daniel's intuition, that a great disaster had been prevented, and that all actions were necessary to save hundreds of innocent people from their impending fate. The operation's success was absolute, a testament to the skill, courage, and planning that went into its execution. But the evidence also bore witness to a chilling truth. The invisible war against terror was a struggle fought in shadows, in spaces between law and morality. It was a world where lives were taken to save lives, where silence was the price of survival, and where the echoes of violence would linger long after the last classified file was closed. The metallic tang of blood filled the cramped space, mingling with the scent of stale coffee and the cloying sweetness of the in-flight perfume, a cocktail of aromas that now reeked of death. Daniel Corrin stared at the screen, a pixelated representation of a Boeing 707, its interior a digital replica of the scene unfolding 30,000 feet above the Mediterranean. He'd pored over every detail of the planned operation, the silent flight, as they'd come to call it. Now, it was done. Rachel Stein had moved. The silence in the secure room was broken only by the rhythmic hum of the servers, each a silent witness to the carnage. Daniel found himself replaying the scenario in his mind, the swiftness of it, the chilling efficiency. He knew the theory, the meticulous planning, the calculated risks, the necessity of decisive action. But now, the theory had become reality. 2 men were dead, their lives extinguished with ruthless precision, and Daniel, he had to grapple with the fact that his call had led to the taking of lives. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the sterile air in the room scratching at his throat. He saw the reports, read the transcripts, studied the photographs, the weapons, the forged documents, the plans laid bare. The terrorist threat was irrefutable. Still, the images, the cold, stark facts, were at odds with the profound moral weight he felt. The reality, he realized, was heavier than the theory. He closed his eyes, his head swimming with the echoes of Rachel's briefing, the cold-blooded pragmatism of the operation, the clinical efficiency that had become a mantra. They had known the risks. They had anticipated every contingency. They had trained Rachel, equipped her, and sent her into that crowded cabin with the chilling knowledge of what was expected. He had made the call. He had authorized the mission. He had, in essence, signed the death warrants. He opened his eyes, staring at the screen again. But the virtual cabin had faded. He could only see the faces of the 2 men, Rossetti and Bellini, the brief glimpses of their lives captured in the intel files. He saw their families, their friends, their unknown dreams. He felt the phantom weight of their lives, and the knowledge that the actions he had authorized had robbed them of their futures. He hadn't flinched when the intel came in, when the risk assessment had been completed and the green light given. Now, as the implications settled over him, he felt a crushing exhaustion, a weight that threatened to suffocate. This was the cost of his success, the dark underbelly of the work he did. There would be no medals, no parades, no public recognition, only the quiet acknowledgement, the silent burden of responsibility that would remain with him, always. Only the echoes of those shots in the silence of the classified files. The human cost, he realized, had only just begun. The invisible war was, in fact, always a very real and present tragedy. The sterile fluorescent lights of the Mossad interrogation room seemed to pulse with an accusing light, reflecting off Daniel Corrin's pale face as he recounted the events of September 15, 1978. His decisions, he knew, had saved lives. But the weight of the lives taken bore down on him with a crushing finality he hadn't anticipated. It was an internal review, a necessary evil designed to ensure protocols had been followed, but it felt more like a public execution of his conscience. The air in the room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and bureaucratic dread. Across the table, a panel of impassive faces, senior intelligence officers, a psychologist, a legal advisor, scrutinized him with a detached objectivity that felt colder than any judgment. The initial reports were in, the physical evidence catalogued, the official narrative meticulously constructed. The question now was Daniel Corrin, the man who gave the order, fit for duty? He began, as he had many times since that day, with the intercepted communications, the whispers of a potential El Al hijacking, the escalating risk assessment, the confirmation of the attackers' profiles, and finally, the agonizing decision to authorize the preemptive strike. He outlined the justifications, the meticulous planning, the calculations that led to the agonizing conclusion. The potential loss of life outweighed the risk of acting. Every detail, every consideration, was dissected under the unwavering gaze of his superiors. He described the agonizing wait as the plane took off, a relentless knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach. Each passing minute was an eternity, punctuated by the shrill silence of the secure phone. The relief, when the all-clear finally came, was immediate, but fleeting. The victory was hollow. He knew that the victory had come at a heavy cost. The silence that followed the operational debriefing was worse. No congratulations, no commendations, only the cold, clinical assessment of his actions. The psychologist's probing questions were the most difficult. He questioned Daniel about his sleep, his emotional state, the moral burden of knowing he had, in essence, signed the death warrants of 2 men. Daniel admitted that nightmares had begun to plague his sleep. Images of the 2 men, their faces, their potential for future violence, played on repeat in his mind. He found himself grappling with the ethics of preemptive violence, the question of whether the intelligence truly justified such drastic actions. He fought against the rationalization, the training, the years of service. He was an analyst, not an executioner. He had made the call, and the dead were the proof. The legal advisor pressed on, referencing the legal gray area, the murky border between national security and the rule of law. Could he be held liable for the deaths of men who hadn't yet committed a crime? The answer, shrouded in bureaucratic jargon, was that he was shielded, protected by the needs of the state. The review concluded with a formal assessment of Daniel's continued suitability for his role. He was deemed competent, his judgment sound. His performance in making this decision was judged exemplary. But there was no praise, no recognition of his courage. He was, after all, just doing his job. Daniel understood. His success, and that of the mission, hinged on the fact that he understood the burden and the price of the shadows. But he knew that the shadows had changed him, perhaps irrevocably, and that he would carry the weight of the silent flight forever. The sterile fluorescent lights of the training room hummed, a monotonous counterpoint to the hushed, expectant faces staring back at Daniel. He stood before them, a cohort of fresh-faced intelligence analysts, all eager and bright-eyed, unaware that the case they were about to dissect had once demanded a cold, brutal calculus of life and death, culminating in 2 lives snuffed out mid-air. He'd seen the fear in Rachel's eyes, the way her hand had trembled, just for a moment during the debriefing, a memory that still clung to him, a phantom ache of the choices he'd helped shape. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, a nervous habit he'd developed over the years. This room, with its blank white walls and the sterile smell of disinfectant, had become his new domain. He was no longer on the front lines, making split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. Instead, he was a teacher, a guide, tasked with imparting the lessons gleaned from the silent flight operation, a case study he'd initially found abhorrent to share, but, after much deliberation, decided he had to. It was a cold case, a grim masterpiece of planning and execution, and it needed to be understood, if only to be prevented from being repeated. Today, we delve into a case that challenged the very core of our principles, he began, his voice steady, despite the familiar knot in his stomach. The silent flight operation. It was a textbook example of high-stakes risk assessment, operational precision, and, ultimately, the burden of choice. He clicked a button, and a grainy image of the Boeing 707's interior flickered onto the screen. He knew this room, knew the faces, knew how this would go. He'd seen this done a dozen times now, a practiced, almost rote presentation. He began to trace the intelligence gathering phase, the initial intercepts, the credible, yet still imperfect information that painted a terrifying portrait of an imminent terrorist attack. The whispers of the PFLP's plans, the intercepted communications, the shaky but seemingly solid information about the flight, its target, and the individuals involved. He explained the profile, the 3 potential terrorists, their motives, the planned methodology. He outlined the excruciating process of weighing probabilities, of estimating risk, of making a determination with incomplete information. The weight of that decision still pressed down on him. Daniel walked them through the intricate planning, the infiltration of Rachel, the agent, into the flight crew. He described the agonizing wait, the monitoring, the slow, agonizing passage of time as the plane lumbered down the runway. He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, allowing the new analysts to feel the anticipation, the uncertainty, the fear. He had been so sure. The information seemed airtight, and yet, the human element, the unpredictable vagaries of individual action, The presence of the third target kept the risk at a level that could have destroyed him. "This is where the operation becomes a study in controlled variables," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The success hinged on a single agent's training, her composure, and her willingness to perform a task most people would consider impossible. Rachel's actions were precise, brutal, and ultimately saved countless lives. But we must never lose sight of what that meant. He gestured toward the screen again, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. It meant a decision made at the highest levels, a willingness to kill before being killed, before innocence died, before the world could react. The metallic tang of blood still clung to Daniel's memory, a phantom scent that accompanied him in the sterile quiet of his apartment long after the official debriefings had ended. He'd signed the non-disclosure agreements, of course, the words a suffocating weight against his conscience. Yet the silence of the successful mission, the absence of public acknowledgement for the lives saved, felt like a hollow victory. He had looked at the two men, Rossetti and Bellini, their faces contorted in expressions of surprise and fear, their lives abruptly extinguished, and felt a profound emptiness settle within him. The files, meticulously organized, detailed the precise calculations, the risk assessments, the intelligence intercepts. They chronicled every step, every decision that led to the execution on Flight 426. He knew the numbers backward and forward, the altitude, the passenger manifest, the probability of success, the probability of failure. But the numbers didn't account for the sleepless nights, the way his hands would sometimes tremble when pouring a cup of coffee, the sudden intrusive images of a young man staring in disbelief. He replayed the crucial moments in his mind, the weight of his decisions resting heavily on his shoulders. He had made the right calls. The intel was sound. The agent, Rachel, a paragon of professionalism. The mission had succeeded. And yet, the echoes of those decisions resonated within him, a discordant symphony of guilt and justification. Daniel walked through his apartment, the muted glow of the late afternoon sun painting long shadows across the walls. He sat heavily in his favorite armchair, the worn leather a familiar comfort against the storm brewing inside. He closed his eyes, visualizing the briefing room, the stern faces of his superiors, the urgent whisper of the mission parameters. He remembered the arguments, the careful calibration of risk and consequence, and the chilling realization that he, Daniel Corrin, was responsible for the lives of every soul on that plane, for the success and failure, and by extension, for the lives of Rossetti and Bellini, the men who had planned the attack. The quiet of his apartment was broken only by the rhythmic tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. Each tick was a beat in the relentless drum of his self-reproach. The weight of the responsibility was an immense burden that slowly chipped away at his spirit. He had to accept that the actions he ordered had a cost. What would their families think? Would their loved ones understand their actions and the consequences thereof? He wrestled with the ethics, the moral implications, the fact that a terrorist plan had been thwarted, yet 2 lives were still lost. There was no easy explanation, no perfect resolution, only the unshakable knowledge that he had ordered those deaths, and that this would live on his memory forever. He rose from his chair, the silence amplifying the thud of his own heartbeat. The success, the lives saved, it all seemed to fade in comparison to the knowledge that he was directly responsible for the taking of life. The silence was his burden now, a constant reminder of the unseen costs of the war, a war fought in the shadows, where the lines between right and wrong blurred with every mission and every decision. He was a decider, now burdened by the decision. He was, in a quiet, lonely way, one of the silent victims. The weight of it, the cold, stark reality of 2 lives extinguished, finally settled on Daniel Corrin like a shroud, a suffocating blanket woven from guilt and a hollow victory. He had saved lives, undoubtedly. He had averted a tragedy, prevented carnage. Yet the price of that salvation was a heavy one, and it clung to him with the tenacity of a shadow. He knew he could no longer bear the responsibility, the burden of deciding who lives and who dies, the endless cycle of risk assessment and the cold calculus of consequence. The sterile fluorescence of the Mossad headquarters, a place he had once found comfort in the predictable order, now seemed to mock him. The incessant hum of servers, the hushed whispers of analysts, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, all were now a symphony of pressure. He sat in his office, the blinds drawn against the harsh Tel Aviv sun, and stared at the framed photo on his desk. His wife, smiling, and their 2 young children. Their faces alight with an innocent joy he no longer felt he deserved. The image, once a source of strength, now served as a painful reminder of the world he was fighting to protect and the sacrifice it demanded. He had requested a transfer. The paperwork was already in progress, a formality that belied the monumental shift in his life. He was moving out of operational decision-making, away from the front line of the war on terror. He would still contribute, analyze intelligence, and advise, but he would no longer be the one to greenlight an operation, to send agents into harm's way, to weigh the potential for collateral damage against the necessity of action. He would, in essence, become a spectator. The decision had not come easily. He had spent months wrestling with the moral and emotional fallout of silent flight. The meticulous planning, the agonizing pre-flight intelligence gathering, the gut-wrenching realization that the third target was not on board, all of it had become a persistent ache in his mind. He replayed the scenarios repeatedly, examining every possibility, questioning every choice. The initial rush of adrenaline, the sense of accomplishment, had long since faded, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. He looked back on the silent flight operation, the averted hijacking, now a case study, a template. He looked at the details, the meticulous analysis, the calculated risks, and the irreversible consequences. The file lay open on his desk, its classified pages a silent testament to the decisions he had made, the lives he had saved, and the lives that had been taken. He saw the cold precision with which the agent Rachel had executed the mission, the way she neutralized the threat with such clinical efficiency, and he wondered if he, too, had become as detached, as devoid of human empathy in the name of national security. He knew he was no longer the right man for the job. The constant pressure, the weight of lives balanced precariously on his decisions, the knowledge of the invisible burden he was carrying, had taken its toll. He needed to step back, to find a way to reconcile his actions with his conscience, to rebuild the connection with his family that had been frayed by the invisible war. The silent echoes of that flight, the ghosts of the lives saved and lost, were a reminder that even in the shadows, the human heart cannot be completely shielded from the light. The sun dipped below the Tel Aviv horizon that September evening, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. Yet for the passengers of Flight 426, it was just another end to a long travel day. They had disembarked, collected their luggage, and dispersed into the bustling terminal. The mundane routine of arrival swallowing them whole, unaware that only hours prior, they had been mere inches from a terrifying fate. They had walked through the security gates, greeted by loved ones, and stepped back into their lives, completely oblivious to the extraordinary measures that had been taken, the sacrifices made, to ensure their safe return. They were a tapestry of humanity, these unwitting survivors. There was the elderly couple, holding hands and murmuring about their grandchildren, their faces etched with the familiar weariness of travel. A young businessman already on his phone, barking into it about meetings and deals, his mind miles away from the quiet efficiency of the plane. A family with boisterous children, their laughter echoing through the halls, completely unaware of the peril that had brushed so close to their lives. They moved through the airport's sterile environment with an unremarkable ease, their conversations filled with the minutiae of everyday life, plans for dinner, and the anticipation of returning to their homes. They were unaware of the silent, unseen heroes who had saved them. The memory of the flight slowly began to fade. The subtle hum of the engines, the turbulence that rattled the cabin, the faces of the crew, all becoming distant blurs. They forgot the kind smiles of the stewardesses, the crisp air of the cabin, and the feeling of the plane's gentle descent. The potential for the catastrophe they had narrowly avoided remained locked away, unknown, a phantom lurking just beyond their reach. The details of the flight, the in-flight movie, the bland meal, the fleeting conversation with a stranger, would become just another entry in the collection of memories that defined their lives. For some, the experience was swiftly forgotten, absorbed into the rhythm of their daily existence. For others, a lingering feeling of unease might surface, a subtle disquiet that they couldn't quite articulate. They might find themselves glancing at the news, catching the headlines of the day, their subconscious whispering tales of terrorism, yet failing to connect it to their own near miss. They would never connect the threads of fate, never understand that their journey had taken a detour through the heart of darkness, that the pleasant young woman who had offered them a drink was, in reality, a shield, a blade, a guardian angel of sorts. Life continued in its usual predictable fashion, and the survivors of Flight 426 went about their lives. They celebrated birthdays, attended weddings, mourned losses, and experienced all the highs and lows that life has to offer, completely unaware that their very existence was a testament to the courage of a woman they would never know, and the hard choices that had been made to save them from a fate they would never understand. The weight of the world, in all its complexity, rested on their shoulders. But their shoulders were light, their smiles were genuine, and their hearts beat with a rhythm that had been spared by the choices made at 30,000 feet, where the only witness was the silent, unforgiving sky. The silent echoes of that perilous journey lingered in the shadows, a secret whispered amongst those who knew the truth, a tale untold, a debt forever owed to the brave and the unseen. The Mediterranean sun, a blinding disk in the cerulean sky, offered no solace to the two bodies being zipped into black bags. Their brief and violent existences abruptly terminated within the sterile confines of a Boeing 707. The flight manifest, meticulously organized and cross-referenced by the airline's security, showed no anomalies. The passengers, blissfully unaware of the silent drama that had unfolded amongst them, disembarked, their faces reflecting the post-flight fatigue of travel. Nothing more. They gathered their luggage, hugged their loved ones, and melted back into the tapestry of everyday life, forever oblivious to the invisible threads that had almost snapped, leaving them dangling in the abyss. Daniel Corin, the analyst who had masterminded the operation from a cramped control room in Tel Aviv, watched the final clearance notification scroll across his monitor, his shoulders slumping with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. The operation, codenamed Silent Flight, was complete. The mission was a success. Yet, the air in the room, thick with the scent of stale coffee and unspoken burdens, felt heavier than ever. The classified files documenting the events of September 15, 1978, were locked away, swallowed by the bureaucratic maw of the Mossad archives. The reports, the photographs, the intercepted communications, the forensic analyses, the psychological assessments, all were sealed, destined to gather dust alongside countless other secrets, each a testament to a world unseen, a war waged in the shadows. The names of the dead, the details of their thwarted plot, their violent end, they remained buried, their final moments reduced to cryptic entries in intelligence logs, filed under the heading Unsubstantiated Threat. For Daniel, the victory tasted like ash. He saw the faces of the passengers, their laughter and their relief as they walked towards their freedom, each breath a gift they did not know they had been denied. The gratitude he felt for the mission's success was muted by the weight of the decisions he'd made, the lives he had, in effect, chosen to sacrifice. He replayed the images of the bodies being carried from the plane, the sterile efficiency of the cleanup, the hushed voices of the investigators. They were ghosts now, fading memories in the grand scheme of things. But in Daniel's mind, they would forever haunt his waking moments. He knew the silence would be the most profound and lasting consequence of his actions. No parades, no medals, no official acknowledgement. The only reward was the absence of a headline, the absence of a global crisis. The reward, if it could be called that, was the oblivion of those who had been saved, the unwritten narrative of their continued existence. They would live their lives, unaware of the thin thread that had connected them to death, unaware of the sacrifices made in their name. The echoes of the operation would reverberate within the intelligence community, dissected and debated in classified briefings, its lessons etched into the training manuals of future analysts. It would become a case study, a cautionary tale, a testament to the brutal calculus of national security. But for Daniel, the real question was not whether he had made the right choices, but how one lives with those choices. The war on terror, he realized, was not just fought in the shadows, but within the hearts and minds of those who chose to fight it. And sometimes, the most silent victories carried the heaviest burdens.